For both the British and the Americans, the Pacific Theatre was undoubtedly the most despised front of the war. However, for the Americans, it proved to be particularly exasperating, as many of their significant advantages, such as speed, overwhelming firepower and technological superiority, were rendered ineffective in this unforgiving environment. Unlike the sweeping campaigns of Europe, such as Normandy or the Battle of the Bulge, which emphasized large-scale maneuvers and massed forces, the Pacific devolved into a relentless grind of brutal close-quarter engagements. Historian Max Hastings aptly described these encounters as a series of violently intense miniatures, fought under conditions dictated by the Japanese. Here, America, a global superpower whose strength was awe-inspiring on the grand stage of World War, found itself unable to translate that dominance into decisive victories on the microscopic battlefields of dense jungles, coral atolls and volcanic islands. Exacted a steep toll on the troops. Adding to the misery were the relentless environmental challenges, tropical diseases that debilitated entire units, swarms of insects that spread infections, and oppressive heat that sapped morale and strength. Together, these factors transformed the Pacific Theatre into a war of attrition, where victory came at an almost unbearable cost. For many Allied soldiers, the physical and psychological toll of fighting under such conditions made the Pacific not only a strategic challenge but also a living nightmare. For the Germans and Soviets alike, the Eastern Front was the most savage and unforgiving theatre of the war, marked by unparalleled brutality and suffering. For the Germans, it was especially disheartening, as the blitzkrieg tactics that had brought rapid victories in the West faltered against the vastness of the Soviet Union and the unyielding determination of its defenders. Unlike the methodical campaigns of the Western Front, where logistics and technology often tipped the balance, the fighting in the East devolved into a series of grueling and chaotic battles that stretched across thousands of miles. The Eastern Front was less a conventional battlefield, and more a sprawling, apocalyptic landscape where entire armies clashed in ferocious confrontations that consumed resources and lives at a staggering rate. The war in the East was fought with an intensity that shocked even seasoned veterans. German forces, accustomed to swift, decisive operations, found themselves bogged down in prolonged sieges like Leningrad and urban nightmares such as Stalingrad, where the fighting was reduced to brutal, street-by-street combat. The Soviets, driven by a fierce resolve to defend their homeland, countered with a combination of relentless offensives and devastating scorched earth tactics, ensuring that no inch of ground was easily won. Adding to the horror were the extremes of the Russian climate, with scorching summers that turned battlefields into choking dust bowls and winter temperatures so cold they froze equipment and men alike. The scale of the conflict, coupled with ideological hatred and a disregard for human life on both sides, meant that the Eastern Front became a theatre of unparalleled human suffering, where survival often felt like the only victory.
The latest orders came this morning. Hold the village, Nemiriv, until we are ordered, for else we were told. It's a small cluster of wooden houses nestled in the cold, surrounded by vast empty fields. When we arrived, the sight that greeted us chilled us more than the winter wind ever could. Scattered throughout the village were bodies, civilians, most of them. Some lay crumpled in the snow, their lifeless faces frozen in expressions of terror. Others had been hastily piled together in a barn that had been partially burned. The stench lingered despite the cold. We don't know who did this. Was it partisans, or perhaps another German unit? None of us dared ask aloud. Questions like that could lead to dangerous answers. The men are quiet tonight, their usual grumbling silenced by what we saw today. Even Franz, who never shuts up, sits by the fire staring into the flames, his jaw tight and his hands trembling slightly. We're all thinking the same thing, but none of us dares voice it. Could we have been the ones ordered to do this, in another time or place? Would we have followed through? I'd like to believe we wouldn't, but I'm not so sure anymore. The war has changed all of us in ways we barely understand. We've fortified the village as best we can. We know the Soviets are coming, their tanks rumbling ever closer. The ground shakes faintly with each distant explosion. I try to write a letter to my mother, but the words won't come. What can I even say? That I'm alive, but barely, that I'm terrified every waking moment, that I've seen things I can't begin to explain even to myself?
The Pacific War was marked by an intensity of hatred toward the Japanese that far surpassed the animosity felt for the Germans. This visceral contempt stemmed largely from the Japanese military's appalling treatment of prisoners of war, a reflection of their adherence to the Bushido Code, a centuries-old code of the samurai that dictated a warrior must never allow himself to be captured. To surrender was to embrace shame. True honor, as prescribed by Bushido, was found in death, either through combat or suicide. This ancient ideology, which cloaked brutality in the guise of chivalry, became the cornerstone of the Japanese military ethos during World War II. This philosophy was explicitly codified in the 1941 Japanese Field Service Code, which declared, "You shall not undergo the shame of being taken alive, you shall not bequeath a sullied name." Reinforcing this doctrine, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo issued stark instructions to his soldiers. Do not survive in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure that you do not leave ignominy behind you. This fanatical creed not only justified the Japanese army's harsh treatment of their own troops who failed to meet these expectations, but also fueled their utter disdain for enemy prisoners. Allied servicemen captured by Japanese forces faced unimaginable cruelty, as their captors viewed surrender not just as a weakness, but as a profound moral failing. This deep cultural divide made the Pacific War a uniquely savage conflict, driven not only by the clash of nations, but also by an unrelenting ideological hatred that stripped it of any semblance of mercy. By the same twisted logic, Allied soldiers who had surrendered and been taken prisoner were deemed unworthy of being treated as men. Unlike the Germans, who, for reasons of practicality and self-interest, largely adhered to the Geneva Convention in their treatment of American and British prisoners of war, the Japanese operated under an entirely different framework. Japan had never formally signed the Geneva Convention and only vaguely committed to respecting its rules, adding the ominous caveat that they would do so only when the provisions did not conflict with Japanese culture. In practice, this so-called incompatibility proved catastrophic, as the Japanese blatantly disregarded the convention's protections. This cultural and institutional contempt for prisoners was reflected in the staggering death rates among Allied POWs in Japanese custody. An astonishing 27% of those captured by Japan died in captivity, compared to just 4% of Western Allied prisoners held by Germany. In the most infamous Japanese camps, the mortality rate soared to a horrific 44%, driven by a combination of starvation, disease, brutal labour, and outright executions. For the Japanese military, prisoners were not individuals with rights under international law, but rather disgraced enemies unworthy of life itself. This stark difference in how the Axis powers treated POWs added an extra layer of horror to the already savage Pacific War, further fueling Allied resolve to defeat an enemy that seemed to lack even a basic sense of humanity. On the Eastern Front, the treatment of prisoners of war descended into a realm of unparalleled brutality, rooted in ideological difference and a total disregard for humanity. For both the Germans and the Soviets, captives were not seen as soldiers deserving of dignity, but as tools. The Germans, or Hitler, had specifically ordered that the Geneva Convention would not apply to Soviet captives, justifying this by claiming that Bolshevik soldiers were undeserving of such protections. The result was mass starvation, forced labour. The death rate among Soviet prisoners held by the Germans was staggering. Over 57% of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured perished in captivity. Camps like Stalag 352 and others became centres of systematic neglect and murder, where starvation, disease, and exposure were as deadly as the bullets that claimed many upon surrender. Yet the Soviets were equally ruthless toward their German captives. Stalin's government, which had also refused to sign the Geneva Convention, saw surrender as a betrayal of the motherland, a stance that extended to their own troops and to the Germans they captured. German POWs endured back-breaking labour, starvation, and horrific conditions in Soviet camps, where the death rate often exceeded 35%. Like the Germans, the Japanese military enjoyed a string of dramatic victories at the beginning of the war, but these early triumphs were less a testament to Japanese strength than to the vulnerabilities of their adversaries. In the 1930s, Japan's conquest in China demonstrated their ability to dominate an opponent that was technologically backward and lacked heavy weaponry. China's poorly equipped armies, often armed with outdated rifles and limited artillery, were no match for Japan's modernized forces. Cities like Nanjing fell quickly, not because of superior strategy, but due to the inability of the Chinese to resist Japan's mechanized advances and brutal tactics. The atrocities committed during this period, including the infamous Nanjing massacre, underscored the Japanese military's reliance on terror and savagery to compensate for strategic shortcomings. In 1941-42, Japan's expansion into Southeast Asia followed a similar pattern. The swift overruns of Hong Kong, Malaya and Burma were largely made possible by unprepared defenders, many of whom were outnumbered, poorly supplied, and untrained for the type of jungle warfare Japan excelled at. The victory at Singapore, often cited as one of Japan's most spectacular achievements, serves as a prime example of this disparity. Here, 35,000 Japanese troops managed to defeat a garrison of 70,000 British soldiers. However, these British forces were primarily composed of inexperienced colonial troops and were supported by outdated equipment, including obsolete aircraft and artillery. The Japanese capitalized on this disorganization, launching a rapid and coordinated assault that outmaneuvered and demoralized the defenders. While the campaign showcased Japan's tactical acumen, it also revealed the extent to which their victories depended on exploiting the weaknesses of their enemies. The Philippines followed a similar trajectory. American and Filipino forces, though brave, were poorly equipped and suffered from logistical challenges that left them vulnerable to Japan's coordinated offensives. The Battle for Bataan exemplifies the brutal realities of these campaigns. Japanese forces, initially surprised by the tenacity of the defenders, resorted to relentless artillery barrages and infantry assaults to break through the American and Filipino lines. Despite fierce resistance, including harrowing bayonet charges and last stands in the jungle, the defenders eventually succumbed to starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The fall of Corregidor marked the collapse of Allied resistance in the Philippines, but the victory was again emblematic of Japan's exploitation of an overmatched and undersupplied enemy rather than an inherent superiority on the battlefield. The Japanese soldier was defined by his unwavering obedience, enforced through a brutal system of discipline that tolerated no dissent. Even the smallest infractions were met with savage beatings, creating an environment where fear and submission were ingrained into every rank. This relentless conditioning extended far beyond discipline and into the battlefield, where soldiers were trained to kill indiscriminately. During Japan's campaigns in China, soldiers practiced bayonet drills on live prisoners, a horrifying ritual meant to desensitize them to violence. Beheadings became routine, both as a method of execution and as a form of psychological warfare designed to instill terror in their enemies. This culture of cruelty and aggression was actively encouraged and rewarded. Excessive zeal in the field was seen not as barbarism but as a demonstration of loyalty and honor. A prime example of this was Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, one of the most infamous figures of the Japanese military. Known for his sadistic behavior, Tsuji's atrocities included ordering mass executions and indulging in cannibalism as a symbol of his hatred for the enemy. On one occasion, he consumed the liver of a dead Allied pilot, proclaiming, "The more we eat, the brighter will burn the fire of our hatred of the enemy." Acts like these were not isolated but emblematic of a broader ethos that glorified violence and equated brutality with strength. This focus on obedience and ferocity created soldiers who were fearless and fanatical, but often devoid of strategic thinking or compassion. While this mindset made the Japanese army a formidable opponent, it also led to countless atrocities and alienated populations in occupied territories, fueling resistance and ensuring that Japan's early victories came at the cost of long-term strategic failure. In stark contrast to the German general staff, which encouraged innovative thinking and strategic flexibility, the Japanese military leadership was rigid and unimaginative, stifled by a culture that prioritized absolute obedience over personal initiative. This lack of autonomy among commanders often proved disastrous in the dynamic and rapidly shifting conditions of World War II. Officers were expected to follow orders to the letter, even when those orders were impractical or outright suicidal. General Masaharu Homma, who led the successful campaign in the Philippines in 1942, became a prime example of the consequences of defying this doctrine. Despite his victories, Homer was sidelined and denied further field commands because he had dared to exercise independent judgment in adapting to the realities on the ground rather than adhering strictly to unrealistic directives. This rigid hierarchy not only stifled talented leaders, but also bred a culture where capable officers were punished for pragmatism. Many, like Homer, were relegated to insignificant posts or left to languish in obscurity, depriving Japan's military of their expertise during critical phases of the war. Such practices ensured that those who rose to prominence often did so not through competence, but through unflinching loyalty and adherence to dogma. By the summer of 1944, this systemic flaw had reached a breaking point. As historian Max Hastings aptly observed, many of those charged with saving Japan by their military endeavours possessed the hearts of lions but the brains of sheep. This lack of strategic adaptability crippled Japan's ability to respond effectively to the evolving challenges of the war. While individual soldiers and units displayed remarkable bravery and tenacity, the inflexibility of their leadership often squandered these efforts. As Allied forces grew more coordinated and resourceful, Japan's leadership failures became increasingly apparent, contributing to the nation's ultimate defeat. One of the most infamous directives of the Eastern Front, the Commissar Order, Kommissarbefehl, issued by Adolf Hitler on June 6, 1941, marked a chilling escalation in the ideological war waged on the Eastern Front. This directive specifically targeted Soviet political commissars, members of the Communist Party embedded in Red Army units to maintain political discipline and enforce ideological loyalty to the Soviet regime. Their presence symbolized the very essence of Bolshevism, a doctrine Hitler despised and sought to eradicate. The Commissar Order declared that captured political commissars were to be summarily executed on the battlefield. Commissars were stripped of all rights. The justification for this barbarity was that these individuals were considered the ideological backbone of Soviet resistance and deemed irredeemable enemies of the Reich. This act set a tone of unrestrained violence for the entire campaign. From the very beginning of Operation Barbarossa, the Commissar Order was implemented with ruthless efficiency. Field reports from Wehrmacht and SS units document the mass shootings of commissars, often carried out immediately after their capture. These executions were conducted in full view of other Soviet prisoners, both as a demonstration of German resolve and as an attempt to demoralize the Red Army. However, the scope of the violence often went far beyond the execution of commissars. The Commissar Order effectively normalized extreme brutality within the ranks of the German military. Viewing Bolshevism as an existential threat to European civilization, felt emboldened to commit atrocities against the Soviet combatants. The Commissar Order was part of a broader ideological framework that distinguished the Eastern Front from all other theatres of war. On the Western Front and in North Africa, combat, while brutal, was largely governed by the traditional laws of war. Prisoners were taken, and civilian populations were not systematically targeted to the same extent. In the East, however, the war was fought as a racial and ideological crusade, with the Commissar Order epitomizing the lawless nature of this conflict. The directive was also a clear indication that Hitler's war against the Soviet Union was not merely a territorial conquest, but a campaign to annihilate Bolshevism and its perceived supporters. This ideological hatred created a cycle of escalating violence. German soldiers, emboldened by the absence of accountability, committed atrocities, while Soviet forces retaliated with equally brutal measures. The Commissar Order did not go unchallenged within the German military. Some high-ranking officers expressed concerns about its legality and its potential to provoke severe reprisals from the Soviets. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, and Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, among others, voiced opposition to the directive. They argued that it would undermine discipline and tarnish the reputation of the Wehrmacht. Despite their objections, the order remained in force, and its effects were devastating. Over time, as the tide of the war turned against Germany, the Commissar Order was officially rescinded in March 1942, primarily for pragmatic reasons. By this point, the Soviets had already begun exacting brutal revenge on captured German soldiers, often offering them no quarter, citing the Germans' own disregard for the laws of war. An American colonel, assessing the Japanese army's combat effectiveness, highlighted a stark dichotomy in their capabilities. He noted that there is seldom any coordination between units, and that the Japanese officer generally has no idea of modern methods of fighting in a large mass. However, he also acknowledged that Japanese small unit tactics are tops, showcasing their remarkable proficiency in decentralized close-quarters engagements. This duality defined the Japanese approach to warfare, lacking the cohesion and strategic sophistication of modern armies, but excelling in the tenacity and skill of their individual soldiers and small units. This imbalance in their fighting methods often dictated the outcomes of engagements. When Japanese forces attacked frontally or launched counterattacks, their lack of coordination and outdated tactics frequently led to devastating losses. Yet, when they adopted defensive positions, they became a fearsome adversary, leveraging their ingenuity and determination to turn the terrain into an ally. The Japanese excelled in constructing extensive and well-camouflaged bunkers and tunnel systems, making them extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. In one striking anecdote, a British officer unwittingly found himself standing directly atop a concealed Japanese bunker, only realizing his peril when a machine gun opened fire from beneath him. This ability to dig in and fight from underground positions prompted General William Slim, commander of British forces in Burma, to famously describe the Japanese soldier as the most formidable fighting insect in history. Another British officer added to this characterization, calling them first-class soldiers in a third-class army. These remarks reflected both respect for the Japanese soldiers' individual courage and skill, and a recognition of the broader inefficiencies and limitations of Japan's military as a whole. It was this combination of individual excellence and organizational shortcomings that defined their role in the war, capable of extraordinary resistance, but ultimately outmatched in the face of coordinated and modernized Allied operations. In this respect, their military code served Japan's rulers well, writes historian Max Hastings. Bushido's rigid sanctions against dishonor ensured that, even in the face of overwhelming odds and certain defeat, Japanese soldiers continued to resist. By 1944-45, as Japan's strategic position crumbled, this code became a powerful psychological weapon. It prevented countless soldiers from surrendering, instead compelling them to fight to the death or commit suicide to avoid capture. Without these deeply ingrained cultural imperatives, Hastings notes, a host of Japanese would otherwise have given themselves up rather than perish to prolong futile resistance. This refusal to acknowledge the logic of surrender made Japanese forces exceptionally tenacious adversaries. It turned every engagement into a grueling battle of attrition, forcing Allied forces to expend immense resources to achieve victory. Even when defeat was inevitable, this fanatical devotion to resistance prolonged the war and inflicted heavy casualties on the Allies. In many ways, the Japanese military's readiness to embrace death was its most potent weapon, ensuring that even as Japan's empire disintegrated, its soldiers would not go down without a fight. The Japanese soldier's willingness to self-destruct, often taking his enemies with him, contributed significantly to the Allied reluctance to take Japanese prisoners, except when intelligence gathering was essential. This reluctance was rooted in the dangerous unpredictability of Japanese surrenders. A soldier who appeared to give up might suddenly spring into action, launching a final, desperate attack when his captor's guard was down. Such incidents, where surrender was used as a ruse to inflict maximum damage, made the practice of taking Japanese prisoners a perilous gamble. For Allied troops on the ground, it was often deemed far safer simply to kill the enemy rather than risk ambush or sabotage. By August 1944, this dynamic was starkly reflected in the prisoner of war numbers. While German POWs were arriving in Allied camps by the shipload, there were only 1,990 Japanese held in American custody. This disparity underscored the cultural and tactical divide between the Axis powers. The Germans, while capable of fanaticism, surrendered in much greater numbers as the tide of the war turned. In contrast, the Japanese soldier, steeped in the ethos of Bushido and the fear of dishonor, viewed surrender as a fate worse than death. This not only prolonged battles, but also forced the Allies into a brutal calculus. Survival often meant leaving no quarter for an enemy that refused to abandon his will to fight, even in defeat. Addressing later accusations that Allied actions mirrored the brutality of the Japanese, historian Max Hastings firmly rejects any suggestion of moral equivalence. He points out a fundamental distinction in the conduct of the two sides. Japanese soldiers frequently exploited the act of surrender as a ruse, luring their captors into a false sense of security before launching a final, often fatal attack. This behavior stood in stark contrast to the Western understanding of surrender, which operated under an implicit code. A prisoner relinquished the right to resist further in exchange for humane treatment. It is hard to see why an Allied soldier should have risked a grenade from a Japanese soldier, who, even when he made gestures of surrender, rejected the Western code whereby a prisoner contracted to receive humane treatment in return for forewarning further homicidal intent, writes Hastings. The Japanese soldiers' frequent disregard for this implicit contract forced the Allies into a grim reality. Treating surrender with suspicion or outright hostility was not a moral failing, but a necessity for survival. Hastings' dismissal of moral equivalence underscores the pragmatic decisions Allied forces had to make when faced with an adversary who weaponized surrender, making the battlefield even more perilous and blurring the lines of conventional warfare. One particularly striking incident illustrates the relentless determination and self-destructive tendencies of Japanese soldiers even in defeat. After the sinking of a Japanese ship off the Nicobar Islands, a sailor was found clinging to the netting on the side of the Allied destroyer HMS Saumarez, which was rescuing survivors. Rather than accept his rescue, the sailor was furiously banging a shell against the hull of the ship, attempting to detonate it. When the shell failed to explode, he dove back into the sea with the grace of an Olympic swimmer, choosing to die alone rather than accept the shame of capture. Such incidents were not isolated. Japanese sailors rescued by US submarines had similarly attempted to sabotage their rescuers, even at the cost of their own lives. Submarines, being particularly vulnerable to internal sabotage, were put at enormous risk by these rescue efforts. After a series of such dangerous episodes, Allied forces were forced to make the grim decision to abandon efforts to save Japanese survivors, a move Hastings describes as prudent. The refusal of Japanese soldiers and sailors to surrender, combined with their willingness to turn rescue attempts into opportunities for sabotage, underscored the unique and often deadly challenges the Allies faced when confronting an enemy so deeply committed to the ethos of death over capture. Fighting in the Pacific Theatre demanded that the Allies adapt their strategy to the unique geography and logistical challenges of the region. Unlike in Europe, where confronting the enemy's main armies head-on was often unavoidable, the Pacific War prioritized reliance on the Navy and Air Force. There was little appetite for engaging Japan's primary ground forces unless absolutely necessary. Instead, the Allies focused on leveraging their naval and aerial supremacy to dictate the terms of the conflict. Among the Allied commanders, General Douglas MacArthur stood out for his innovative and highly praised approach to amphibious warfare. His strategy of island hopping avoided direct assaults on heavily fortified Japanese positions. Instead, MacArthur emphasized bypassing enemy strongholds, isolating them, and allowing them to wither on the vine as their supply lines were severed. This approach exemplified the effective use of America's strengths, enabling the Allies to choose the where and the when of their battles. MacArthur's method not only maximised the advantage of superior naval and air power, but also minimised Allied casualties, a critical consideration in a theatre characterised by brutal fighting. By targeting key islands and leapfrogging unnecessary engagements, MacArthur demonstrated how strategic ingenuity could transform a gruelling war of attrition into a calculated campaign that aligned with the resources and capabilities of the Allied forces. His successes highlighted the importance of flexibility and precision in a war fought across vast oceanic expanses. Joseph Stalin stated, "Such talk of retreat is lying and harmful. It weakens us and strengthens the enemy, because if there is no end to the retreat, we will be left with no bread, no fuel, no metals, no raw materials, no enterprises, no factories, and no railways." It follows from this that it is time to finish with retreat, not a step back. The infamous Soviet Order 227, famously known as Not One Step Back, introduced harsh measures to enforce discipline and ensure unwavering commitment from Red Army soldiers during the darkest days of World War II. Among its directives were the establishment of penal battalions, Strafbats, and blocking battalions, Zagradbats, both of which epitomized the brutal methods employed by Stalin's regime to prevent retreat and instill fear in the ranks. To popular belief, it said soldiers were shot, even though many were, but in actuality many were sent to different battalions where it would pretty much result in death. Soldiers of any rank found guilty of disciplinary offences, ranging from cowardice to insubordination, were reassigned to penal battalions, which were often tasked with the most dangerous missions. These units were infamously used to clear minefields by marching directly across them, sacrificing themselves to pave the way for the main infantry units. Order 227 decreed that these men, considered to have committed crimes against the motherland, could only redeem themselves by shedding their blood in combat. Another grim creation of Order 227 was the blocking battalion, stationed at the rear of advancing forces. Their primary duty was to ensure no soldier retreated or faltered. Armed and positioned to cover the battlefield, these units were instructed to shoot on sight anyone who lagged behind, hesitated, or attempted to flee. At the Battle of Stalingrad, blocking battalions played a notorious role, executing thousands of Soviet soldiers deemed to have shown insufficient resolve during the fierce combat. While these measures undoubtedly reinforced discipline through fear, they also reflected the desperate situation faced by the Soviet Union in 1942 as its armies struggled to hold the line against the advancing Wehrmacht. The brutal efficiency of these units ensured compliance at a staggering human cost, leaving behind a legacy of both heroism and horror on the Eastern Front. One of the most harrowing aspects of the Eastern Front from 1943 to 1945 was the Soviet Union's relentless use of overwhelming force and sheer bloodshed to win battles. This approach, often described as a strategy of sacrificing human lives on an industrial scale, is vividly recounted in hundreds, if not thousands, of personal letters, memoirs, and accounts from soldiers on both sides. The Soviet tactic to dislodge German positions frequently began with intense artillery shelling or mortaring designed to weaken the enemy's defences. However, due to limitations in communication and reconnaissance, the effectiveness of the bombardment was often uncertain. Undeterred, Soviet forces would press forward regardless of whether the shelling had achieved its objectives. This resulted in devastating casualties as waves of infantry charged into well-prepared German defences. Entire battalions could be wiped out in minutes, but fresh waves continued to surge forward. For the Germans, these assaults were both terrifying and bewildering. The sheer volume of Soviet soldiers charging headlong into machine gun fire, mortars and artillery often defied comprehension. German troops were frequently forced to hold their positions until they expended their last rounds of ammunition, overwhelmed by the unending human wave tactics. These attacks embodied the Soviet strategic calculation. Against a determined but numerically inferior enemy, attrition was an acceptable cost for victory. This brutal methodology became a defining feature of the Eastern Front, where the Soviet command demonstrated a willingness to absorb staggering losses to achieve their objectives. Such tactics reflected not only the Red Army's unrelenting resolve, but also the desperation and ruthlessness born from their struggle for survival against the Wehrmacht. While effective in grinding down German forces, this approach came at a horrifying human cost, leaving an indelible mark on the soldiers who witnessed and endured its consequences. Villages across the Soviet Union became brutal battlegrounds during World War II, as two of history's most brutal armies, the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, clashed with devastating consequences for the civilian population. For those caught in the crossfire, survival became a relentless, day-to-day struggle against starvation, violence, and exploitation. For many, the simple act of finding food became a near impossible task. Bread, once a staple of daily life, became an unattainable luxury. Families scavenged for anything remotely edible, with mothers boiling bark, weeds, or leather scraps to stave off hunger. Children, too weak to walk, succumbed to malnutrition in heartbreaking numbers, while those who survived often bore scars of unimaginable hardship. The plight of the villagers worsened as the tide of the war turned, with the Red Army counteroffensive reclaiming territory at an equally devastating cost. Villagers already weakened by starvation faced forced conscription, reprisal killings, or accusations of collaboration. For many, survival was not just about finding food, but also avoiding the violence and brutality that accompanied each new wave of occupation. The Red Army, in its desperate fight to repel the German invaders, was no less ruthless in its demands on Soviet civilians. Villages already ravaged by war and looting were further depleted as conscription took away nearly every able-bodied man. Left behind were women, children, and the elderly, who had to shoulder the full burden of survival while contending with the unyielding demands of the Soviet state. Even as these families struggled to feed themselves, the Soviet government imposed grain quotas on their communities, prioritizing the war effort over civilian needs. These quotas were often impossible to meet, especially for villages stripped bare by the Wehrmacht or devastated by scorched earth policies during retreats. Yet failure to deliver the required grain brought severe consequences, ranging from arrests to executions or deportation to the Gulag. For many, the choice was between starvation or risking everything to meet the state's demands. This dual exploitation, caught between the Red Army's relentless requisitions and the German occupation, left entire communities destitute. Women and children worked the fields under unbearable conditions, scrounging for any means to survive. The elderly, weakened by hunger and labour, often succumbed to exhaustion or malnutrition. Yet even in the face of such hardships, many civilians remained defiant, clinging to the hope of eventual end of this war. In the final stages of the conflict remain one of the most tragic examples of the power of propaganda and the devastating impact of war on a civilian population. As the Allied forces advanced across the Pacific, many Japanese civilians, steeped in fear and distrust, chose death over surrender due to years of indoctrination by their government. In the battles for Saipan and Okinawa, where American forces launched major invasions in the final stages of the Pacific War, Japanese propaganda reached some of its most insidious and tragic depths. Civilians on these islands were bombarded with terrifying falsehoods, told that capture by the Americans would lead to unspeakable atrocities. They were led to believe that American soldiers would not only torture them, but might even eat them. A grotesque distortion of reality designed to sow fear and discourage surrender. Like most countries, these lies were deeply rooted in years of militaristic propaganda that had portrayed Americans as brutal and inhuman barbarians, unworthy of mercy or trust. For civilians raised in a society where honor was intertwined with loyalty to the emperor, and where death was often considered preferable to shame, such misinformation had devastating consequences. This cultural and psychological manipulation was particularly catastrophic during the Battle of Saipan. Entire families, gripped by fear of capture, committed mass suicides, jumping from cliffs or drowning in the sea. Similar tragedies unfolded in Okinawa, where civilians, urged by both propaganda and military orders, chose to die rather than surrender. Many civilians killed their children and themselves, convinced they were sparing their families from fates worse than death. The American forces, horrified by what they witnessed, made desperate attempts to halt the mass suicides. They broadcast assurances through loudspeakers, promising humane treatment to any civilians who surrendered. American soldiers even risked their lives to approach terrified groups, pleading for them to come down. Despite these efforts, few civilians believed the Americans, their minds poisoned by years of propaganda portraying Allied troops as inhuman monsters. The tragedy of Saipan's cliff stands as a part of the Pacific theatre. The devastating power of fear and indoctrination reveals the lengths to which the Japanese leadership went to preserve the illusion of honour, even at the expense of their own people. For the Americans, it was a moment of profound sorrow, marking a grim chapter in the Pacific campaign and foreshadowing the challenges yet to come in the battles for Japan's other territories. Stories of torture, mutilation and execution circulated widely among German troops. Some were true, fueled by the harsh conditions of the Soviet POW camps where starvation, disease and overwork claimed countless lives. Other fears were exaggerated or fabricated, but no less terrifying. Propaganda from the German regime also heightened these anxieties, depicting the Soviets as barbaric and merciless, ensuring that German troops would fight to the death rather than surrender, but many of the rumours were true. The reality was often just as grim as the fears. Captured German soldiers were frequently subjected to immediate execution, especially in the heat of battle. Those who survived were marched to the infamous Soviet labour camps, where survival was a near impossibility. Tales of these horrors spread like wildfire, deepening the dread among troops, mutilation among German soldiers, and stories that are so bad I can't even say here on YouTube. In the rear areas, the fear of Soviet partisans was ever present. These irregular fighters waged a ruthless guerrilla war against German occupiers, striking supply lines, ambushing patrols, and assassinating collaborators. The partisans were often supported by the local population, who had suffered immensely under German occupation and sought vengeance. For German soldiers and administrators, the mere presence of partisans was terrifying. Partisan attacks were often brutal, involving ambushes where survivors were seldom taken. Those captured by partisans faced even worse fates. Stories of captured Germans being tortured or executed in particularly gruesome ways circulated widely, whether through direct experience or through rumours amplified by fear. The partisans' actions also forced the Germans into increasingly draconian countermeasures. Entire villages suspected of aiding partisans were razed, their inhabitants deported. This, in turn, only deepened the resolve of the local populations to resist, creating a vicious cycle of terror and retribution. For German civilians living in the occupied territories, particularly Volksdeutsche settlers, the fear of Soviet retribution was equally paralyzing. These civilians were often the targets of partisan attacks and bore the brunt of Soviet revenge as the Red Army advanced westward. Stories of mass assault, looting, and murders committed by Soviet troops spread like wildfire, convincing many civilians that capture meant certain death or worse. This fear prompted a mass exodus of German civilians as the war turned against Germany. Entire families fled westward in desperate attempts to escape the advancing Soviet forces, abandoning homes and belongings. Many perished along the way due to starvation, exposure, or attacks by partisans. The Eastern and Pacific fronts of World War II stand as two of the most harrowing and brutal theatres of conflict in human history, their savagery unmatched by the relative constraints of the Western and African fronts. On the Eastern Front, the sheer scale of destruction, ideological hatred, and the disregard for human life resulted in an apocalyptic struggle between Germany and the Soviet Union. Entire cities were leveled, civilians were subjected to starvation, forced labor, and soldiers endured unimaginable conditions, from the frozen wastelands of Stalingrad to the scorched fields of Kursk. Similarly, the Pacific Front was characterized by its relentless, island-hopping campaigns and fanatical resistance by Japanese forces, where surrender was rare and both sides engaged in tactics that pushed the limits of human endurance. Civilians in places like Okinawa and Saipan suffered not just from the immediate horrors of war, but also from indoctrination and propaganda that led to mass suicides and generational trauma. In contrast, the Western and African fronts, while devastating, were governed by more conventional warfare and at times adhered to established military protocols, providing a stark contrast to the all-encompassing ideological and barbaric nature of the battles in the Eastern Pacific. This stark disparity underscores why these two fronts are remembered as unparalleled in their scale of human suffering and unrelenting brutality. And with that, we wrap up today's video. I'm incredibly grateful to have you here until the end. Your support truly means the world to me. A huge shout out to my amazing patrons. If you'd like to support the channel or get access to some exclusive content, the links to my Patreon and Instagram are down below. I hope you learned something new, and as always, I'll see you in the next adventure. Take care and goodbye for now.